Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I'm really excited to be here. I want to express my deep gratitude to Kelly and to Amanda and the whole team for putting this together, volunteering, supporting, and creating this space for us. So my name's Jillian Hufnagel. I am going to be here talking to you about how open source plays a key role in some critical areas of the software supply chain. Before I dive into that, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I have been in 9 startups. Slim AI is where I'm at currently. I am the head of culture, and I am not a developer. So that's something I just want to set the stage. I am not a hands-on keyboard kind of person when it comes to writing code, but I do understand kind of everything that goes into building a really healthy organization around a strong mission. I have spent time in video game companies. I've spent time in pen testing companies, in 2FA and MFA companies. And Slim AI is an organization that helps developers who are working with container technology. So can someone drop in the chat, how does the audio sound and are the slides clear? I'm going to check my messages. I'm going to ping Amanda. How do I sound? Awesome. Okay, thanks. Perfect. So let's get going. So some of you may be experiencing the upper part of this image where you are baby Yoda. You are just getting into cybersecurity, InfoSec, DevOps, DevSecOps, or anything that kind of falls into that category. I'm hoping that my presentation today will help you not age into the bottom portion of the slide quite as quickly as what old Yoda looks like. So today we're going to talk about, in general, just like the open source landscape, what it's looking like right now, and what are some of the things that we should understand so that we can kind of paint the picture of where we're living in today's world with open source. We'll talk about what is software supply chain security. Why should I be aware of it? And then I'm going to give you some three very practical examples of what developers and teams supporting developers are doing today, specific to things within the software supply chain that are being elevated as best practices. So SBOMs, signing, and slimming. And then we're going to have a live discussion. We'll use chat about, how do we drive influence cross-functionally when we are either part of the development team or part of the teams that are supporting the development of a product. So there are some really interesting stats that I was putting the slides together, and I tagged Kelly in, and she was blown away by the stat that 150 developers globally are responsible for the majority of code in the top 50 open source projects, right? That's crazy, right? There's 180,000 open source and free software products in the world today. Like, I'm sure there's more than that. That's just the estimate that we receive from the Cloud Native Compute Forum. About 90% of code base everywhere in every company in the world includes free and open source software. So the Linux Foundation is a great resource to understand what that landscape looks like. They partner with Harvard to produce a lot of reports every year. And one of the reports that they produce is a census around open source projects. And at the end of this slide deck, there's actually a link to all of the resources that I'm referencing that you guys can go take a look at. I think the other thing that's really interesting is that Gartner projected years ago, I think they projected in 2019, that 75% of companies are going to be using container technology. Like, that's really interesting. 75% of all companies by the end of this year are going to use container technology. So why don't folks drop in the chat and let me know, do you understand container technology, or should we spend some time doing Containers 101? Containers 101. Okay, you got it. Yeah. All right. I see that, Jerry. Yep, absolutely. Need a better understanding. Okay, cool. So there's a couple ways you can interact with containers in your coding life cycle. So you may be working on a project that is in a private repository that belongs to your company, but is still cloud-based, right? Containers are all cloud-based. Um, when you are working on a project inside of a container is it's like deciding that I want to start with things that already exist because I don't want to build from scratch. So you can go get an empty container and you can pull that empty container from Docker. You can pull it from Amazon ECR. You can pull it from Red Hat. You can pull it from Oracle. There's a lot of public repositories where you can say, I want to go start with a container. And as a developer, you're probably going to start with something that you recognize. You're like, okay, well, maybe I want to start with an Ubuntu container, but this Ubuntu container is massive. And I like working in Ubuntu, but I don't really understand all the components that are inside this container. But I'm going to go ahead and grab it because it's something that looks and smells like things that I know. So I want to work with this container. So then as a developer, you start adding things into that container based on the cloud application that you want to build. And as you're building, that container is getting larger and larger and larger. And the thing that is true about containers is that when you're working in your private cloud, you're not really spending any money on working in containers. Where you're spending money is when you go to deploy your cloud-based application. Containers that are large take a longer time to load. You're paying for the load time. So developers who want to and enjoy working with containers should be aware that to optimize your container, you should really think about how big it is and what's in it. The challenge with that is there's a lot of dispersed tools out there and a lot of dispersed kind of processes around how do you make your container optimized. Looking for inside, look at insider threat. Can anyone assist? Oh, Christine, I'm going to defer you to the mods. So when we think about how many public repositories there are globally, we think about how many open source projects there are globally. And then we think about in those public repositories, there's billions, like millions, right? Millions of images and packages that you can play with. Well, I'll argue in this conversation with you guys and guys and gals and non-guys and gals, I will argue in this conversation with you that you can actually start with fat containers and still have a good, healthy process to be able to minify them and have good practices in your continuous deploy workflows. So one of the things you want to consider is that when you are deploying a container, it could be something that significantly slows down or stalls production. So how many of you have ever deployed a container and it negatively affected production? Be honest, we're all friends here. How many of you recognize Evergreen? Okay. So let's talk about how containers play a key role in the software supply chain. So software supply chain attacks are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. They're all the time. Log4j was a huge attack that came through an open source project. SolarWinds, another one. Those are just two of thousands of software supply chain attacks that have occurred recently. And so we as the individuals who are either writing code and deploying code, or we are the team supporting them, whether we're in CorpSec or DevSecOps or DevOps, we really need to think about where are the areas within the software supply chain that we can be more proactive and we can get ahead of the things that are going to drive efficiency and optimization for our companies, right? So Kelsey Hightower is a friend of mine, and he's an advisor at Slim. We're super, super grateful to have him on our team. And he actually wrote he wrote a GitHub repo that says that literally says write nothing and deploy nowhere. And he did it as a joke, but his joke has meaning underneath it. The safest code is the code you don't ship. So think about that. The safest code is the code you don't ship because there's no way it can have a vulnerability. Now, that's not the reality. We hear leaders saying all the time, ship faster, ship more. And at the same time, there's this like shift left mindset that's happening that's basically saying shift all of the work and all of the knowledge and all of the expertise over to the developer because we want to save cost. We want to save time. We don't want to have huge teams that are supporting the development organization. We want the developers to do it right the first time, right? Well, the challenge is if we want developers to do it right the first time, we need to make it easier for them, right? So there are a couple things that are occurring right now to make workflows have more visibility and more refinement for developers. So there's the software bill of materials, there's signing, and then there's what my organization does, which is help people help them slim their containers into efficient images. So a software bill of materials is something that's really hot right now. Someone actually mentioned that this is a really hot topic. It is a really hot topic, right? Being able to deploy secure containers is a very, very hot topic. SBOMs are a software bill of material, which is essentially a list of absolutely everything that's inside that software. The challenge with SBOMs is that it's really hard to actually list everything that's inside the software. So we'll go into that in a minute. Signing is a way of like actually attaching a signature, like a digital identity to the developer that actually contributed to the piece of code, and or creating a chain in a distribution of who owns it, right? So when something is immutable, it means that it doesn't change and or it can't change. And then there's slimming, which we'll dive into more later on with some fun analogies around recipes and things like that, thanks to my friend Kelly who helped prepare it. So SBOMs are really interesting because they're actually they're like a requirement for anyone who is producing and selling software to the US government. And oftentimes that expands beyond just the US government itself and expands into any parties that are secondary or tertiary parties delivering software to the government. So you might be in an organization that delivers a service to a company, and then that company uses a part of that service to then deliver their service into the US government. So the executive order that was passed in 2020 requires any vendor selling that software to include the SBOM. The SBOM can include things like a license package. It can include, any version control. It can include literally anything that has gone into the creation of and the maintaining of that software. The issue with it is it's very hard to maintain. Another issue with it is that the visibility is not always there in terms of how open source plays a role into developers choosing to put things into their code base. So we're going to see a lot more in the coming years on best practices around SBOMs and automating those workflows to make it easier for developers so that there's less manual labor around SBOMs. So before I go on, were there any thoughts or questions on SBOMs? Any areas that folks are curious to dig in a little bit deeper? Cool. So again, pros, helps you know what's in your container. It's essentially like that nutritional label, like when you get a package of pasta, you turn it over, it shows you everything that's in it. That inventory should be machine readable. And then the cons are, it tends to be something that you do after the fact. It's reactive. Maintaining it is challenging. And then there's inconsistency among some of the tools. So let's talk a little bit about signing, right? So Sigstore and Notary do this really, really well. There's a lot of other vendors out there that do this, but it's a cryptographic proof that the author is who they say they are, right? So it's kind of like a blockchain technology that says this is who they are, and we can verify that this is who they are. So for developers who are required to provide a digital signatory, Sigstore and Notary can definitely help with that. Now, if you're not the developer, you might be supporting the development team. If you're in CorpSec, this is going to matter to you. If you're in DevOps, this is going to matter to you, right? Because as you're supporting the teams that are developing the code, you're also going to be supporting making sure that the SBOM and the signing are accurate and accessible. So the trust factor comes in, right? When you're delivering software to an end user or an end customer, they want to trust that you know what you're delivering to them. And that's one of the best ways to actually expand and grow a business is through trust. The provenance is something that, when it is automated, is actually easy to support. More and more tools are going to be coming out, right? So like gaining support of those major platforms is also going to be a pro. The cons is that even though we're saying that it matters that the trust is there, it doesn't imply that everyone needs to do this, right? So it becomes one of those like, is it a best practice that I have to do because it's a best practice? Or is it something that I'm going to have to be jamming into my organization and getting them to go along with this best practice, even though they're not quantifying the need? Maybe I don't have someone at the CIO or CISO level that is seeing this as a need, but I believe it as a best practice. So we can talk at the end about how do we influence our teams and organizations towards it. It doesn't prevent vulnerabilities. And it doesn't prevent bad actors. So, this would not support, the challenges organizations are facing with things like Log4j. So any questions or thoughts on SBOMs or signing yet? All right, let's talk about slimming. All right, so when I was preparing for this conversation, I had a great chat with Kelly, and we were thinking about, this goes back to like the container 101 conversation at the beginning. How do we help people understand what slimming is in a container by using analogies that are, everyday analogies? And Kelly came up with the idea of subletting your friend's apartment, and they're like, hey, take my furniture. And you're like, I really don't want your furniture. I just want to sublet your apartment. So slimming it would be removing their furniture, and then you have this clean space for yourself to go in and put in your own furniture. So you can take your container, you can slim it into an image that has only the things that you need, and then continue to build upon it. Starting with a pre-made cookie mix and taking out all the chocolate chips. That's a ton of manual labor. It's super hard, right? So you want to find automation tools that are going to help you do that. Another one was this concept of you go into, like a high-end grocery store or a nice, takeout restaurant to get a salad, and they've prepackaged, you've got the almonds in this bag, and you've got the raisins in this bag, and you've got the dressing in this bag, right? You can decide how you want to build your salad. What are some other analogies that people have used when you talk about using container technology, and how do you manipulate what's in your container? Any other good analogies in the audience? Keep thinking on those and drop them into the chat. So slimming is this concept of I only want to have what I need. The challenge is that you need to be an expert in what's in the container. And you also need to either find a tool or manually remove the things that you don't need. That's super labor intensive. And developers, all the developers that I've ever met, just want to build cool stuff. They don't want to be experts in these details. They want to have confidence that what they're building is going to be good for the business and the customer, but they don't want to spend time going through, oh, Valerie, I like it. Packing for hiking. Nice. So developers don't want to spend the time trying to be the experts. Like the shift left movement for them has been miserable, absolutely miserable. So what we want to do is we want to say, okay, how do we help folks who are involved in the continuous deploy cycle have more efficient and effective containers? Slimming used to be manual, super intensive. My organization has had an open source project for 7 years called Docker Slim. If any of you have ever used Docker Slim, I would love to hear it in chat. We've had over 500,000 downloads of Docker Slim. We've got 13,000 GitHub stars. Our founder CTO put out Docker Slim as a labor of love for anybody who believes in cloud-based applications and they just want to be able to work with really efficient images rather than bloated containers. So check out our open source, and actually, Amanda, if you want to drop that in the chat for me, Docker Slim is a GitHub project. If you want to grab that for me, I should have given you that link in advance. So SBOMs and signing, they're things we have to do to some extent, depending on how we're delivering our software and who we're delivering it to. Slimming is something that we absolutely all should do, but we're not. And so I was at PyCon in Salt Lake City last week, and I got to meet with just some fantastic developers. And so many of them were saying, I work with containers. Absolutely. I love containers, right? None of them said I have any best practices for slimming. None of them said I have any best practice for optimization. Some of them did say, oh yeah, I already use Docker Slim. It's awesome, right? So what's happening is we want to be able to shift the power back into the hands of the people who are actually writing and deploying the code. We want to be able to say, deploy only what you need when you need it. And remember what I said earlier when we were talking about those fat containers, when those containers are really, really large, they take a long time to load. Sometimes they actually break production and you're spending a ton of money. So what slimming does is it automatically removes everything that you don't need. You still have a functioning cloud application that you can deploy. You've significantly reduced the attack surface by 20, 30, even higher X, right? So you have a container that went from, being extremely bloated to have an optimized image that could be 30 times smaller simply by running Docker Slim, which is our command line tool, right? You just run the open source command line tool and you have this super efficient image. We also have in our SaaS, we have other tools that help developers partner around container collaboration. So you can share your repositories with each other. You can put in a list of approved images into your collection. You can connect your private repositories. And our SaaS is open, it's free, it's available. Everyone should absolutely use it if you're doing anything with container technology. But I would love to hear, thank you, Amanda, for posting the link. For folks that are already using container technology or folks that are considering it, what are some of the concerns you have about using containers in your workflows? I'd be curious, Jerry, when you say you're using them, but you need a better understanding, do you have a cross-functional process around how you use containers? All right, I won't put you on the spot. So the pros obviously are you're reducing the size and the attack surface of the container. So who does that make happy? That makes your CorpSec team happy. That makes your compliance team happy. That makes your CIO and CISO and your CTO happy, right? Because what you're doing is you're removing vulnerabilities. Ownership or lack of ownership of containers. Thank you, Anne. I love this. Okay. So when you think about the ownership of the container, right? You might have a developer who's been on your team, they were working on a container and they've since left, right? Who owns that container? How can we make sure that that container doesn't get lost in its life cycle? How do we have a better understanding of that container? What are the packages in it? What's the version history of it, right? The lack of ownership of the container is really interesting because if you don't have a tool that allows you to collaborate around the specific containers, then you don't actually have control of it, right? And so what Anne is touching on is like another pro is like you're cutting out, you're not allowing the links in the chain of the supply chain, right? So the software supply chain needs to include all of the information about how the software was built and deployed, right? It needs to include who owned that container. It needs to include who changed that container. So using a tool like Slim AI, you can have visibility into all of the things that are in the container. You can x-ray everything in it. You can look at everything that is in the container line by line, like a layer cake. So you can x-ray it and you can open up that whole container. You can go find a license package. You can go look at a library. The other things that you can do is, as Anne is saying, it's like the lack of understanding across the teams, right? You can actually have a place within a tool like what Slim has to say, this is our collection of containers. These are the ones that we're working on. These are the ones that are approved for prod, right? And maybe you partner with a CorpSec team and the CorpSec team is the only one that can approve a container for prod, right? So those best practices around that supply chain and around build and deploy, when you're using tools like Slimming, you know that the image that's being deployed is the most optimized and efficient. The other thing that a tool like Slim does is it allows you to diff the container. So you can say, show me what it looked like before I slimmed it and show me after. And you have this red-green comparison, right? Whole Foods and Apple know everyone on their supply chain network. Yeah, Aisha, absolutely, right? It's a requirement now. Organizations that aren't getting on board with what are those requirements for visibility in that supply chain are going to not be able to keep pace with where the industry is going, and they're not going to be able to sell to the list of customers that they can today because more customers have these expectations moving forward. Minification and slimming gives you better optimization and performance. It reduces cost. Being able to manually slim a container is really complex. It's super challenging. It adds a ton of work for developers. And actually, Aisha, hop in on this stat. How many hours do we save roughly a development team by slimming? Was it like 160 hours or something like that? It was huge, right? Jerry, good question. What happens when it's removed? So with the Slim technology, we don't actually remove, we build a new image. So you still have your base container. And what it does is it builds a functionally equivalent version with only the things that are necessary. So you can always still go back to that original base container and reference it if you need to go and see if there's something else that you needed that was in that base container that didn't come over in that original rebuild. The rebuild is really accurate. We're not seeing challenges with developers using the tool saying the minified image is not what I need. We have developers saying this is amazing. The minified image is exactly what I need, right? How do you measure cost? Is it employee time saved? Yeah, and it's a couple things, right? It's employee time saved. It's cost to deploy, right? When you deploy to the cloud, you pay based on the load, the uptime, right? So if you're deploying smaller, you're saving cost just at the beginning of deployment, right? You're reducing friction among teams. So one of the things that's true in software deployment, especially today, is that the cross-functional alignment between a development team, a CorpSec team, a DevOps team, an ops team, et cetera, right? And sometimes a legal team. There's a lot of friction in the visibility across all of those teams and the alignment across all of those teams on how to make sure that we're deploying efficiently and cost effectively, right? So when you think about reducing the friction across the cross-functional collaboration, that's not just hours, right? That's productivity. That is making developers and teams around developers happier. And when people feel really good about working in a team that is aligned and efficient, you're increasing your team happiness and you're increasing your retention, right? And we all know there's a really big race for talent right now. So if you can influence your organization towards these best practices, right, then you're creating efficiencies across the organization. You're also creating more trust across the organization, right? Developers trust that when CorpSec is bringing them another suggested tool like Slim AI or another tool that's going to make their workflows optimized, they're going to see that the CorpSec team brought them something else that helped them work more efficiently. So it really increases that cross-functional collaboration and team happiness. I just want to make sure I'm not missing any questions. We talked about cost. This reminds me of the issue of test coverage and documentation, necessary, awesome things that are hard to maintain and even generate for some businesses. Absolutely, Valerie, right? Like, think about that. Like, there's so many added benefits to having optimization of your containerization and your container workflows. Aisha's right. We're saving on deploy time. Jerry, yeah, absolutely, right? Happiness is a tough one, right? So the future of software, when we think about whether or not we're already in cybersecurity or we're already in a software supply chain company, and whether or not we are writing and deploying code ourselves or we're a team that supports the writing and deployment of code, shipping and building more secure, more optimized software upfront is the future. It absolutely has to be the way that we approach collaboration as teams. So let's talk a little bit about how do we influence cross-functionally. So I know it's kind of hard to have a live discussion in chat, but you guys are absolutely crushing it. I'm so excited to see the engagement. So it's Ops' problem. I deployed it. They have to deal with it. This is the problem with shift left, right? Shift left is it's somebody else's problem. I'm going to throw it over the fence. That creates friction. That creates waste. That creates misalignment. It creates lack of engagement for your extended team. It creates lack of engagement for your work because you don't have pride in what you're doing, right? You think about all of these things. So Kelly and I were chatting again, prepping for this, and she said, I wish we talked more about how do we influence for best practices when we are parts of, whether it's the technical team or the team supporting the technical teams, thinking about influence. I think one of the big things about influence is the concept of being able to reduce judgment and, focus on positive intent, right? The positive intent is that we all do, most of us really want to build and deploy things that are good, right? That's hard to do if we don't have best practices and we don't have cross-functional alignment on what's the best way to do that. So when you folks are thinking about how do you drive alignment, where are you getting stuck in your organizations around things like best practice and cross-functional workflows? Or maybe it's like with the folks that, write the check. Maybe you can't get commitment in your organization to actually pay for new tools and products that are going to improve those workflows. Anne's trying to be proactive to get buy-in from devs around the importance of supply chain security, specifically SBOMs. Okay, cool. How do you end up ensuring that executive leadership understand the importance and set the right message to the engineers so that we aren't reactive? Yeah. So one of the things that's hard to convince people of is that if we do this now, it'll create less pain later. So I like to do things incrementally and in like small bites. So if you haven't already established trust on those cross-functional teams with the engineers, or your current engineering team doesn't already have that trust, I would focus on how do we bite off a small project at once, use that as validation that we're going in the correct direction, right? Maybe we just decide to start scanning all of our containers now. And maybe we don't fully implement slimming, but we at least scan them, right? And we have an understanding with the X-ray tool of what's in them. You know, we've seen with there's another tool out there that we really love. There's a vulnerability tool called Sneak. We'll use Sneak to scan a container and see that it's got 700 vulnerabilities in it, and then we'll go ahead and slim it, and it's got like 1. Right? So when you say, how do I make it easier and how do I get the buy-in? There are things that we can do to say, hey, team of developers, guess what? This container has 700 vulnerabilities in it, and if we slim it, it'll have 1. Guess what? I already did that for you. Ta-da! Right? You're just making their life easier by being proactive about where you can push on those little opportunities to build trust cross-functionally. And I do want to go back to Anne's comment around how do you get the buy-in from executive leadership? There are some things around like the psychological concept of the carrot versus the stick, right? The carrot is I can influence them by showing them that the future will be bright if we do this, and that, everything's going to be good if we do this. That's the carrot, right? How do I lead and influence through positivity? Well, that carrot could be things like, if we implement container best practices just through something like slimming, we're going to save X amount of dollars, right? That's a very clear result that you can give to your executive leadership team. And they're going to say, why wouldn't we save this money, right? Then there's the stick. The stick is like President Biden's executive order around SBOMs, right? The stick is something that you absolutely have to comply with. And so you can use both the carrot and the stick in your influence model. I would say understanding how your leaders make decisions is the key to this, right? You don't want to just assume carrot and or stick or both. You want to think about, how do I convince this person? How much information do they need to see in order to decide, right? How much data are they going to need? Are they the type of leader who has no problem spitballing, throwing things against the wall and trying stuff out? Don't waste your time putting together a huge budget in a spreadsheet. Just say, hey, we're going to do this. My intent is to roll this out, and then we'll talk about it, talk about the results after, right? Aisha's absolutely right. You want to frame security as an enabler, right? I firmly believe, having been in so many cybersecurity companies, that the opposite way to approach a problem is fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I don't think it drives the right psychological response for anyone in any business. I have been in startups for 20 years. I've worked in large and small companies. When you try to convince someone to do something by scaring them, you're not putting them in a healthy decision-making framework, right? Developers do understand. Aisha's right. Developers understand that security is important. We just have to make it easier for them. Jerry, when you talk about those silos, I can make assumptions what you mean about those silos, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of those silos you're referring to are things like developers don't have the autonomy to deploy because they can only build so much before CorpSec or DevOps leans in, and then developers don't feel ownership of what eventually gets shipped to prod because there are all those gates in their ability to own that workflow. That's one assumption I can make off of a silo. I think another assumption I can make off of silos, based on my experience in any organization, is that context is lacking. So another thing that, Kelly and I were talking about when we talk about influence, documentation drives clarity. When you take the time to actually write out your thesis, when you take the time to say, the purpose of this is to do this. The things that we've discovered along the way are these. The things that we know to be true are that, and the things that are unknown are this, right? And so what you do is like you start to bring other people along the journey of how do we solve a problem or create or address an opportunity cross-functionally through something like documentation. You might put that in Confluence. You might put that in Trello. You might put that in your internal wiki. But for people to have the opportunity to understand how your mind is approaching a problem is a really beautiful way of influencing them towards seeing it from your perspective. It's also another way of engaging them to contribute and to ask questions. Um, folks who tend to be a little bit more introverted or folks who tend to be really cerebral want to have the time to read and think. And another thing that you could potentially do is maybe you're the type of individual who's a little bit more like me. You are more comfortable talking live. You are more comfortable having like an ideation session. Well, maybe record a Loom video or record a video and send it to someone and say, I just need to think out loud. I don't need you to respond, but I just need to hear me think out loud so that we can figure out, am I assessing the right starting point for this, right? Aisha, absolutely. When we provide developers with automation and tools, right? Like we're showing them this is the path that makes your life easier. We are allowing you to go at the speed at which you want to go while still checking all of the compliance and security boxes. Right. And so I think the other thing to consider is, we've only got a couple minutes left, but, before I keep going, what else is top of mind for folks? What are some of the other things that you want to understand if you are, considering your container journey and or you want to optimize your container usage? I'm also going to ask a favor. I really like feedback. That's also something that's critically important when you want to drive cross-functional alignment in your organization and among your teams is telling people in a timely fashion how they made you feel and giving them pointers and feedback on how they could improve. So, we had 45 minutes scheduled for this session. I'd love to hear, what did you think? Was it fun? Did you learn something? Did I talk way too fast? Is anyone afraid of containers at this point? Security as it goes forward. Absolutely, Jerry. Yep. And thank you. Yeah, let's do more of this. You guys can all hook up with me on LinkedIn, Twitter. I'm not on Twitter as much as I should be, so you can find me there if you want. The contributions made this presentation as effective as it is. So gratitude to everyone for leaning in and participating in the chat. Michelle, not afraid. There is no try, there's only do, right? Another Yoda reference for our, May the 4th friends. Awesome. I'm super grateful to have been here with all of you. I know that the security team is going to be providing all of the resources. Come geek out with us in our Discord. We have a Discord channel. There's on the resource link, we've got the 3 S's of software supply chain, container slimming 101. Aisha, who's in the chat with us today, she is the main contributor to our container report, which evaluates the top 100 containers. Tons of great stuff from the Cloud Native Compute Forum. And then, of course, if you want to dig in on containers and you're like, even if you're early in your journey, join us in our Discord community. I can attest that all of the folks in our Discord community are just as geeky and welcoming as I am. So please join us there. What are some recommended best practices and tools for container security? I'm biased. I think Slim AI is awesome and it's free, so you should definitely use it. We're an early stage startup, so I think having an understanding of the vulnerabilities. We mentioned Sneak already. I think Sneak is just a fantastic tool. In the slides earlier, we talked about, tools for signing. And, I think it really is, it's around how do you drive optimization and efficiency in your container collaboration, both from an executive level visibility perspective and then also from a teaming function. And Malini, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but feel free to ping me afterward, and we can dig in a little bit more on like what was important to you in that question in terms of what is the use case that you're trying to optimize when working with containers, because security is a big statement, right? There's many ways to approach security. I mean, I would say minifying your containers is one of the best places to start. I'm getting my 1-minute warning. I think we're close to closing. I am so grateful for everyone participating. Thank you. All right, let's go over to the keynote.